So you want to learn about state management and you want to use it in your application, but you don't want to learn another library. That's okay. There are tons of state management libraries out there, but we can do it all through React. I recently was on a large project and didn't want to pull in a new library, and so I did it all through React, and we're going to do a step-by-step tutorial to walk you through some of those learnings that I got from my project. And we'll also have the code available for you to download for yourself so that you can look through everything that we're going to walk through. So we're going to start with a React app that I spun up with Create React App. Just to note that we'll be using TypeScript because I personally like TypeScript, but you do not have to do that for your app. It will work with or without TypeScript. So as you can see in my browser, I have just a hello world and just an app file. So we're going to start with a survey form as our example that we use throughout the demo. This would obviously work with any form or any other instance, but that's just what we're going to go with for this demo. Go ahead and add a new file of survey form. Import React. Create our new class of survey form. And we are not going to pass it any typings just yet. And we'll create an empty state object, which we'll get to in just a moment. And we'll create our render method. And return a div. And then let me just secretly copy over my code here. And go ahead and save that. And then we'll move back to our app file and import the survey form that we just created. And then we'll replace our hello world with our survey form. And if we save, on the browser you can see that we now have that component that we just created. So we have our label here, it says first name, we have our input, we can type whatever we want. But right now we don't have any state tracking. So let's move back over to the survey form and go ahead and add some state. So we'll create a quick interface here, since we're using TypeScript. Call it iSurveyForm_state. And it's just going to have an input value. And we'll go ahead and pass it into our class. And define it on the state itself. And then we'll go ahead and add our input value. And we'll have it be nothing. So let's save. Make sure everything's still working. It is, so that's great. And then we'll go ahead and add a value of our state. So we'll make it this.state.input value. Save. And now, when I type, nothing happens because the value is equal to the input, which is nothing. So, working correctly. Now we'll go ahead and add an onChange event. So we'll set this to a new method of onInputChange. Oops. And we'll go ahead and create that method up above. Change. Set the E to any for now. Save that. Then we'll go ahead and use this.setState to update our input value to be whatever the user is typing. So if we save this out, this should be working again, and it is. And just as a little test, we'll throw in a div below that will just contain our state value. And it's not happy because it needs to be contained within my div. And throw that down there. Alright, so now if we look over here, as we type, we can see we're getting the state value. So we are in fact retaining our state and seeing it displayed on the screen. So for our next step, we'll move into making things a little bit cleaner, and we'll optimize this form by creating a separate component that we can reuse. So we'll create a component that just contains the label and the input, and we'll call that text field. Once again, we'll import our React. We'll create a new class of text field. We'll pass it any for now. Create an empty state object. And create our render method. And I'm going to do my magic copy again. And we will pass through a label and an input, just like we pulled from our survey form. Actually, we'll just pull it right from here. And then we're going to go back over here and we're going to import our text field that we just created. And then we'll add it in here. Okay. So we're going to get an error because we have some things in our text field that need to be updated. So how do we pass in our label and our input value into this text field? Well, we'll send them in as props. So we'll create an interface in our text field for our props. And we'll have a label and an input value. And then we're going to pass through a new method that we're going to use to lift state. And that's going to be called update answers. Well, it's going to be an event. That would be any for now. And it does not return anything. So we have these new prop values. We're going to go ahead and reference them in our render method. We're going to destructure them out of our props. And then we can update what now says first name to be label, our input value to be value, and our onChange event to be update answers. So we've now passed that all through as props, but we haven't sent anything through in our survey form into text field. So we'll go ahead and update that to have a label of first name, value, call, we added a new method called update answers, which we will reference and update here just a moment. So we had on input change, we're now changing that to be called update answers. Everything else stays the same, it just has a new name. And then if we save, as you look back in the browser, everything should be looking as it was before. If we type hello, you can see that it's showing our state. So we've now successfully abstracted our label and our input to make it more reusable. And we've passed through the on-change values up to our survey form. So this was a really simple way of lifting state, but you may think that this isn't very realistic, that you have to do something a lot more complex. So right now we're handling our input value and our label directly off of the text field. But if you were to have more than a single input value, it could get really complex in your state. So at this point, we're now going to start updating our state to look a little bit different. So we're going to throw in a couple new interfaces. iAnswer and iAnswers. We'll walk through those as we get to them. So we're going to update our state to look a little different. So we're going to create an answers object, and then within that we're going to create some values that can be used in however many questions that you're going to have. We're going to call it question 1, but this could go on infinitely. It's complaining because right now our interface still references the input value. So we need to update our interface state to the answers. So as you can see, we're now referencing iAnswers. Right here in TypeScript, we have a variable key. We're referencing it by ID. That represents question 1. And then the object within question 1 is an iAnswer, which is defined above. Should be label and value. So right now it's missing a label and value, so we'll go ahead and add that now. We'll add a label of first name and a value of empty string. So it's happy now. So we have our new state. We have a bunch of errors in the browser, but we'll ignore those for now. So now that we've created our new state object, we want to update our text field to instead pass through the object that we created, instead of passing through individually a label and a value. So we're going to delete this just for a minute. We're going to go back over to our text field, and we're going to update our props. So instead of a label value, we're going to make this an answer object that is going to contain a label and a value. Additionally, we're going to pass through an ID, and we'll see why we do that later. Then we're going to update answers, but we'll do that in a little bit. We're going to need a way to track our state within this component, so we're going to add a state now of input value, and then we're going to pass the state in, this interface state in to the component, and then we'll quickly define it here. And again, we'll make this an input value of an empty string. So we have our answer object, so these props are no longer accurate. So we'll update this to be answer and ID. So now instead of label, it will be answer.label, and instead of value, it will be answer.value. And then we're going to go ahead and add an ID onto our input. We'll see why we do that in a bit. We're going to go ahead and update this to be a new method within this component. And then we're going to go ahead and create that method up here. Alright, so we have our new method. If we go back here, we've updated our props, but we're still missing a few props. We're looking for ID to come through and update answers. So we'll go ahead and add those now. ID, actually, string will be question 1, and then our answer is, oops, not quotes, put this in brackets, this dot state dot answers dot question 1. So we're sending in that object. So once again, we'll add a test so we can see if everything's coming through correctly. Put our answer values here. State answers question 1 value. Leave this one. All right, we're getting closer. So the big remaining part is how do we update the state? So we're going to work through that a little bit together. So we're going to go back to our text field. And we're going to go to our on input change. So first we're going to destructure our props. So we'll destructure update answers, answer, and ID. Then we're going to copy over the answer so we can manipulate the value and we're not mutating it directly. And we will spread the answer object, which will automatically copy it for us. Then we're going to update that value to be whatever the user typed. So e.target.value. And then we're going to call once again to that prop method with some new parameters. So we're going to send through that copied answer as well as the ID. So that's looking good. So now we'll go back to survey form. So update answers is no longer correct. We're not expecting an E anymore, and we're not setting state in the same way. So we're going to update that to have that sub answer object of iAnswer and the ID. We're going to copy over the whole state object because, again, we don't want to mutate these objects directly. So we're going to once again do that through the spread operator. So now we have that copied over variable. And then we have the ID, so we can use that as our key to update just that part of the answer object. Oops. Send through our ID. And then we'll have that equal to the answer object that is being sent through from text field. And then finally, we will set our state to that new answer object. So as you can see, we're no longer getting errors in the browser. And we're going to add one more thing. We're going to create a new method that won't do anything. But if this were a real application, you probably would be sending your answers through to some sort of service or API. So we'll just add that here. And just not do anything with it. So everything should be working. All right, so as you can see, it's all working. So we successfully lifted state and created a more realistic object that you could utilize for multiple questions without it being too difficult to track. So along those lines, we're going to go ahead and add a second question. So we'll call it question 2. We'll make it last name. Value equal to nothing. And I'm going to go ahead and copy over text field. And we're going to update our state variable and our ID name. And actually, let's go ahead and also destructure some of this stuff to make it a little cleaner, a little easier to read. Answers. And then from there, we'll pass in our question 1 and our question 2. So just a little bit cleaner. Same here. And now that we have 2 values, let's update this to the answer value for question 1 and answer value for question 2. Go ahead and save, and then if you look over here, you can see we now have a first name and a last name. So we'll type in our first name and a last name. And as you can see, those are each tracking individually. So the last part that we're going to talk about is, you may wonder, what if I have multiple nested components? How do I continue to lift my state through multiple levels? So we're going to go ahead and add another layer of abstraction. So this is a survey, so let's say we're going to have multiple screens for the survey. So we'll create a new component called first screen. And then we'll throw some of the things that are currently in here into a first screen. Import React. We'll have to import our text field since we'll be using that. And then we're going to create our class. And now we'll make this any. And then we'll make a render method that will return a bunch of text fields. Let's add a couple more. Question 3, question 4. we're gonna have this be referencing a local method, since this is another layer of abstraction. So we're gonna have update answers come through as a prop. So let's go ahead and create a prop interface. We'll send through our answers object, and we'll also send through the update answers method. Oops. And we need to import this. And going down here, we'll go ahead and destructure our props. So now we've successfully abstracted out our first screen. So let's go back to survey form, and we will update this to be first screen. And then we need to pass through our answers object as a prop. Oops. And our update answers method. Go ahead and make a couple additional updates to support this. We'll add a question 3 and a question 4 to our state object. And then we'll update down below. So moving back, you can see that we now have all of those form fields on the screen. And we should see everything we tracked. You can see it down below. And everything is displayed on the screen. So just to recap, we created that further layer of abstraction. We passed through that update answers. So it came through as a prop in the first screen. Then we further sent it along into text field. And then on change, we're calling that prop. So it's populating up through the components all the way up to the parent inside of survey form. So we went through the demo. Hopefully now you have a really good understanding on how to lift state just using React. And like I mentioned in the beginning, you might be wondering, how do I know if this approach is right for me? One of the questions to ask yourself is, how well do I know React and how comfortable am I with React? If you pull in a state management library like Redux, that's a lot to take on learning-wise and a lot to sort of try to remember. So using just React is a really good way to get super familiar with the library and be very comfortable with it and not overwhelm yourself. The second question that you could ask yourself is, how complex is my app going to be? You may not have a lot of state that you need to track. So in that instance, you wouldn't need anything more complex. React automatically has state built in, and as we've shown, you can lift state through multiple components and handle it that way. And the third question is, you might say, my app is going to be complex, but how is it going to be nested? So how many layers of components are you going to have, and how many levels deep do you have to track your state? You may have a really shallow structure, and that is a perfect example of when it makes sense to use React. And then finally, we didn't touch on it, but React has the context API that is built to be used for tracking state at a more global level. React sort of discourages using it for more granular details, but any sort of global app state that needs to be tracked can be done through the React context API. And for more information on that, you can check the React docs. And if you found this tutorial helpful and you want to refer to the source code, there is a link below that you can grab from GitHub.